Daoism. But has Confucian humanism been sufficient for the Chinese people? It has, and it has not. If it had completely satisfied man's instincts, there would have been no room for Taoism or Buddhism. The middle-class morality of Confucianism has worked wonderfully for the common people, both those who wear official buttons and those who kowtow to them. But there are people who do not wear or kowtow to the official buttons. Man has a deeper nature in him, which Confucianism does not quite touch. Confucianism, in the strict sense of the word, is too decorous, too reasonable, too correct. Man has a hidden desire to go about with disheveled hair, which Confucianism does not quite permit. The man who enjoys slightly rebellious hair and bare feet goes to Daoism. It has been pointed out that the Confucian outlook on life is positive, while the Taoistic outlook is negative. Daoism is the great negation, as Confucianism is the great affirmation. Confucianism, through its doctrine of propriety and social status, stands for human culture and restraint, while Taoism, with its emphasis on going back to nature, disbelieves in human restraint and culture. Of the two cardinal Confucian virtues, benevolence and righteousness, Lao Tzu contemptuously said, "No character, then benevolence. No benevolence, then righteousness." Confucianism is essentially an urban philosophy, while Taoism is essentially rural. A modern Confucianist would take city licensed pasteurized grade A milk, while a Taoist would take fresh milk from the milkman's pail in the country fashion. For Lao Tzu would have been skeptical of the city license and pasteurization and the so-called grade A, which smells not of the natural cream flavor, but of the city councilor's ledgers and bank books, and who, after tasting the peasant's milk, can doubt that Lao Tzu was perhaps right. For while your health officers can protect your milk from typhoid germs, they cannot protect it from the rats of civilization. There are other deficiencies in Confucianism also. It has too much realism and too little room for fancy and imagination. And the Chinese are childishly imaginative. Something of that youthful wonder which we call magic and superstition remains in the Chinese breast. Confucianism provides for the existence of spirits, but takes care to keep them at a distance. It recognizes the spirits of the mountains and the rivers, and even symbolically those of human ancestors. But it has no heaven and hell, no hierarchy of gods, and no cosmology. And its rationalism shows little interest in magic and the pill of immortality. Even the realistic Chinese, apart from their rationalistic scholars, always have a secret desire for immortality. Confucianism has no fairies, while Taoism has. In short, Taoism stands for the childish world of wonder and mystery for which Confucianism fails to provide. Taoism, therefore, accounts for a side of the Chinese character which Confucianism cannot satisfy. There is natural romanticism and a natural classicism in a nation, as in an individual. Taoism is the romantic school of Chinese thought, as Confucianism is the classic school. Actually, Daoism is romantic throughout. Firstly, it stands for the return to nature and the romantic escape from the world, and revolt against the artificiality and responsibilities of Confucian culture. Secondly, it stands for the rural ideal of life, art, and literature, and the worship of primitive simplicity. And thirdly, it stands for the world of fancy and wonder, coupled with the childishly naive cosmology. The Chinese have been adjudged a matter-of-fact people, yet there is a romantic side to their character which is even deeper, and which shows itself in their intense individuality, in their love of freedom, and their happy-go-lucky view of life, which so often completely mystifies the foreign observers. For myself, I think the Chinese people are immensely greater for it. In every Chinese there is a hidden vagabond, with his love of vagabondage. Life under the Confucian code of decorum would be unbearable without this emotional relief. For Taoism is the playing mood of the Chinese people, as Confucianism is their working mood. That accounts for the fact that every Chinese is a Confucianist when he is successful, and a Taoist when he is a failure. The naturalism of Taoism is the balm that soothes the wounded Chinese soul. It is interesting to note how Taoism is more the creation of the Chinese people even than Confucianism, and to see how the naturalistic philosophy of Lao Tzu became allied through the working of the folk mind with the Chinese interpretation of the world of spirits. Lao Tzu himself had nothing to do with the pill of immortality or with Taoistic magic. His was a philosophy of laissez-faire in government and naturalism in ethics. For he believed in a government which does nothing as the ideal government. What man needed was to be let alone in his state of primitive freedom. Lao Tzu regarded civilization as the beginning of man's degeneration, and considered the sages of the Confucian type as the worst corrupters of the people, as Nietzsche regarded Socrates as the first corrupter of Europe. With his mordant wit, he said, "Sages no dead, robbers no end." His great follower, Zhuangzi, followed up with brilliant satires against Confucian hypocrisy and futility. It was all so easy, for Confucianism, with its emphasis on ceremonialism and anxiety over the distinctions of mourning periods and the thickness of coffin panels, and with the intense desire of its followers to seek official positions and save the world, lent itself easily to caricature. The hatred of the Taoist against the Confucianist was the natural hatred of the Romanticist against the Classicist. Perhaps it was not hatred, it was merely an irresistible, mocking laughter. From this thoroughgoing skepticism, it was but a step to romantic escape from the world and return to nature. Lao Tzu left his post, according to legend, in his old age and disappeared outside the Han Kuquan Pass. Zhuangzi was offered a high post by the king of Chu, but replied by asking whether it was wise to be kept and fed like a pig, and then slaughtered and offered up on the sacrificial altar. From that moment on, Daoism has always been associated with the recluse, the retirement to the mountains, the worship of the rural life, the cultivation of the spirit and the prolongation of man's life, and the banishment of all worldly cares and worries. And From this, we derive the most characteristic charm of Chinese culture, the rural idea of life, art, and literature. The question may be asked, how much was Lao Tzu responsible for this recluse ideal? The Taoism ascribed to him is a lesser literary accomplishment than the books of Zhuangzi, the Chinese Nietzsche, but it is a more concentrated essence of old roguish wisdom. It is, to my mind, the most brilliantly wicked philosophy of self-protection in world literature. Besides teaching laissez-faire and passive resistance, it taught also the wisdom of stupidity, the strength of weakness, the advantage of lying low, and the importance of camouflage. One of its maxims was, never be the first of the world, for the simple reason that thus one could never be exposed to attack, and consequently never fall. It was, so far as I know, the only known theory of ignorance and stupidity as the best camouflage in life's battle, in spite of the fact that the theory itself was the result of the highest human intelligence. Human intelligence in Lao Tzu had seen its own dangers and began to preach, "Be stupid," as its greatest message. It had seen the futility of human effort, and therefore advised the doctrine of doing nothing as a saving of energy and a method of prolonging life. From this point on, the positive outlook on life became negative, and its influence has colored the whole Oriental culture, as may be seen in the novel Yasao Paoyan, and in all lives of great Chinese. The conversion of a bandit or a recluse into a man of the world with responsibilities toward one's fellow beings was always represented by a Confucian argument, while the romantic escape from the world was always represented by the Daoistic or Buddhistic point of view. In Chinese, these two opposite attitudes are called entering the world and leaving the world. Sometimes these two points of view struggle for supremacy in the same man and at different periods in his life, as may be seen in the life of Yuan Chonglang. A living example is that of Professor Liang Suming, who was a Buddhist living in the mountains, but who was reconverted to Confucianism, married, and is now conducting a rural school in Shantung. The rural idea of life, art, and literature, which is such an important feature of the Chinese civilization, owes a large measure to this Taoistic feeling for nature. In Chinese paintings on scrolls and porcelain, there are two favorite themes, one being the happiness of family life, with pictures of women and children in their leisure, the other being the happiness of rural life, with pictures of a fisherman or a woodcutter, or a recluse sitting on the ground under a group of pine trees. These two themes may represent respectively the Confucianist and the Taoist ideal of life. The woodcutter, the herb gatherer, and the recluse are more closely associated with Daoism than the average foreigner would suspect. The Taoistic feeling is well expressed by this favorite poem. I asked the boy beneath the pines. He said, the master's gone alone, herb-picking somewhere on the mount, cloud hidden, whereabouts unknown. This feeling for nature practically overflows in all Chinese poetry and forms an important part of the Chinese spiritual heritage. Yet here, Confucianism plays an equally important part. The worship of primitive simplicity was consciously a part of the Confucian tradition. The agricultural basis of Chinese national life was partly built on the family system, which identified itself with ownership of land in the country, and partly on the Confucian dream of the Golden Age. Confucianism always harked back to the early period of the emperors Yao and Shun as the Golden Age when life was at its simplest and the needs of man were fewest. It was spoken of as a period when the people squatted on the earth and sang to the rhythm of sticks beaten on the ground, so happy and innocent that the burden of their song was, "We go to work at sunrise and come back to rest at sunset. We know nothing and learn nothing. What has the emperor's virtue to do with us?" The worship of the ancients then became identical with the worship of simplicity, for in Chinese the two notions are closely related, as in the word kupo, or ancient and simple. The Confucian ideal of the family has always been that the men partly study and partly till the ground, while the women spin and weave, as against the Taoistic poem quoted, and essentially supporting it in the praise of the simple life. We have, for instance, the poem which Chen Shiju, a scholar at the end of the 16th century, handed to his children as his family heritage. Life is complete with children at your feet. Just a handful of hay hides your cot. If land is sterile, to make it fertile, a young calf will surely help a lot. Teach thy sons to read, too, in spare hours, not for fame nor for mandarin collars. Brew your wine, plant bamboos, water flowers, thus a house for generations of scholars. The Chinese ideal of happiness was, then, not the exercise of one's powers along lines of their excellence, as was that of the Greeks, but the enjoyment of the simple rural life, together with the harmony of social relationships. The real force of Daoism, especially among the people, however, consists largely in supplying a world of unknowables, which Confucian good sense banished from its province of ideas. It is recorded in the Analects that Confucius seldom talked about the supernatural and the spirits. Confucianism offered no hell and no heaven, nor any formula for immortality of the soul. It solved the problems of human nature, but left out of consideration the riddle of the universe. It was at a loss to know even the workings of the human body. In this way, it left a large loophole in its philosophy, and allowed the popular mind to disentangle, with the help of Taoistic mysticism, the mysteries of nature. The workings of this mind were soon apparent in Huai Nanzi, who mixed philosophy with a wonderland of spirits and legends, starting out with the dualistic notion of yin and yang, female and male, principles already current in the period of the warring kingdoms. Daoism soon added to its territory the fairies of the ancient Shantung barbarians, who dreamed of a fairyland out on the high seas, to which place the first emperor of Qin actually started out with 500 boys and virgins to seek his immortality. The hold on the imagination then became irresistible, and from that time till the present, Daoism has always maintained a firm foothold on the Chinese people, especially in the Tang Dynasty, when it became, for a long period, the state religion, known as the mystic religion, because the Tang imperial house had the same surname as Laza, Li. In the Wei and Qin dynasties, its vogue was so great as to completely overshadow Confucianism, and the fashion for Taoism became connected with the first romantic movement of Chinese literature and with the reaction against Confucian decorum as it had been transformed by the late Han scholars. One of the famous poets compared the Confucian gentleman walking in his narrow path of righteousness to a bug creeping along the seams of a man's trousers. Man's nature had rebelled against Confucian restraint and ceremonialism. In the meanwhile, Taoism widened its sphere and included under its arts medicine, or secret knowledge of the herbs, physiology, and cosmology, all more or less symbolically explained on the basis of the yin and yang principles and the five elements: magic, witchcraft, aphrodisiacs, incantations, astrology, a good hierarchy of gods, some beautiful legends, a priesthood, and a pope. All those paraphernalia that go to make up a good, solid, popular religion. It took care, too, of Chinese athletics by specializing in boxing, and the combination of boxing and witchcraft produced the Huang Jin rebellion at the end of the Han dynasty. Last of all, it offered a formula for bodily hygiene, chiefly by deep breathing, leading up to immortality by ascent to heaven on the back of a stork. Its most useful word was qi, air, breath, spirit, which, being invisible, was most susceptible of mystic handling. The application of this qi was practically universal, from the rays of a comet to boxing, deep breathing, and sexual union, which was sedulously practiced as an art, with preference for virgins, in the cause of prolongation of life. Daoism was, in short, the Chinese attempt to discover the mysteries of nature.